Welcome to Orensha Tech's PowerShell series. In this video, we're going to be going over variables. Variables are a common element in scripting and programming, and PowerShell is no different. All of the objects that we've been creating have the ability to be stored into a variable for later use, whether that's a collection of objects or just a single object. And that can be as simple as a string or as complex as a process object, or even the ability to store a web response in a variable to reuse through the shell. This can even be the contents of a file or a list of file objects. Really, anything can be put into a variable, which then can be reused through our scripts or shell session. At a very high level, a variable is just a reference to a chunk of memory, and PowerShell makes this very easy for us. We don't need to define what that memory will be used for, and we can change what type of data is stored in that memory at any time by simply just redefining the variable. We don't need to specify whether it's an int or whether it's a string or a char. These things are handled by PowerShell under the hood for us, so variables are very easy to handle in PowerShell. Now, to recap, everything in PowerShell is an object, and that literally means everything. Even a string is an object. And let's look at an example of this. So let's take our hello world string and we'll pipe this into get member to show us the details of this string. So right here we can see the type name is system.string. So PowerShell handles this string as an object. These are all the methods that we can take on that object, and these are the properties. Now let's look at a process object to see how that differs. So here we can see for process objects, the type name is system.diagnostics.process. And these are all the properties and methods that we have for a process object. All right, now that we've recapped what objects are, let's look at putting one of those in a variable. So to put our hello world string into a variable, first we create a variable and then we define our string. And just like that, we put our string into the variable str. And we can see that by just typing in our variable and hitting enter. And it will display what we have in that variable. Let's look at one for processes. So there we ran get process, and the entire output of that command is then stored into this processes variable. And to run that back, we have all of that data. So as we can see with our variable, the $sign is what initiates the call to the shell that we're about to specify a variable. The $sign symbol is not a part of the variable name. In this instance, str is our variable name, and the $sign is the call to the shell that we're defining or specifying a variable. Now, variable names can contain letters, numbers, and symbols, and they can even contain spaces. But to do this, we have to put our variable name inside brackets. So here, if we wanted to name our variable my variable with a space in there, we can do that. We just have to put it in brackets so that it knows that everything inside the brackets is the variable name. Now, this is kind of clunky and not really used widely in PowerShell because we've got to type in 2 extra characters just to create our variable. So more often than not, we're going to see just our $sign and then something like my variable, or a better way is if it's a string, you can do str variable. If it's an int, we do an int variable. So defining our variables and calling out as much as possible what that variable is and how it's used is the preferred way that we name our variables. And really, this comes back to good coding hygiene, because if we name our variables something self-defining, then we have to put less comments in our code, because people are going to be able to read our scripts and see exactly what that variable is So we don't have to add an extra comment into there. We can just use our comments to describe the general logic that's happening. So best practices are to create self-documenting variable names, and that really goes for everything in your scripts. Try to make everything as self-documenting as possible. But that is a more advanced topic. And another more advanced topic that we'll just briefly cover here is scope. So variables have scope that they are defined within. And this really just means that a variable can only be called within a specific context. So if we have a variable here, str, then this variable's scope is the current session of PowerShell that we have open. As soon as we close this PowerShell session, that variable goes away. Now, there are such things as global variables, and those are things like our environment variable. These are variables that span across the context of our sessions and persist, but the variables that we create within the session are going to be bound to the scope of that session. This can even get more granular, and variables that we create within a function are bound to the scope of that function. So scope is a more complex topic, but for your sake here and just learning variables, know that the variable is only going to exist within your session when you create it in that session. It's not going to persist outside of the session when you close it. All right, now let's jump into using variables. Let's define a path variable and assign that to the temp folder on my computer. So now we can use our get child item commandlet, and specifying the path, we can just use the variable that we created. So you see, variables are used as a placeholder for another either string variable or object of any kind. You can just put that right in where you normally would have put the object that the variable holds. And as I mentioned earlier, the objects that are stored in the variables can be changed at any time without having to redefine what the variable is. So say we have our path, and we'll run get member on this, and we can see that this is the system.string object. Now let's change this and assign this to the value of 15, which is an int object. And we can see that by piping this into get member. And right there, our type name is system.int32. So we are very easily able to change the type of object in a variable, which, if you know anything about C or C++, some of the older programming languages, you had to define the variable very manually. So this is something that makes variables in PowerShell very easy and very beginner friendly. All right, next let's look at variables inside of quotations. And the difference between that is how a variable is handled in either single quotations or double quotations. In single quotations, everything is treated as a literal character. So if we take our str variable and we assign this to a string object using our single quotes, we have another variable inside this, which is our path variable, except with single quotations, this isn't going to work to put the path variable in there because everything is treated as a literal character. So the $sign is not making a call to the shell that a variable is being declared. And if we run the str back, we can see it took everything literally and then returned us the $sign as a literal character. Now, if we jump into using double quotes, it actually is going to pick up that we're trying to call a variable there. So let's just run the same thing here. And we can see even in our shell, it realizes that we are trying to call a variable. So let's call this back, and there we go. Why is my path 15? Because we had assigned path to 15 earlier. So within the double quotes, we can actually remove the special meaning of characters like the $sign by using the back tick. So if we run this again and assign this to y is my path, and then we use the back tick before our $sign, and then close this up. We have our double quotes, but this backtick, you can see this isn't green anymore, is removing the special meaning of our $ character. So if we run this and then grab our str variable, it's right back to the way it was. Now, the backtick mostly removes special meaning, but it can also add special meaning. So let's run the same thing here, and we'll grab our double quotes, and we'll use backtick n and our path variable. So in this case, the backtick actually added special meaning. We run back our str, you can see that the backtick n added a carriage return into our variable. So backtick can either remove the special meaning of a character, or it can add special meaning to a character depending on the way that we use that. And if you want to learn more about this, you can run help about special characters, and that will tell you everything that you'd want to know about that backtick and creating special characters. Okay, next let's go over object properties, because they can be a little bit tricky when using quotations. So if we define a variable called process and assign that to get process, and then we'll filter on our PowerShell and select just that first one. Now we can take our str variable and we'll assign that to process ID, and we'll try to assign this to the ID property of that process variable that we had. However, that's not going to work exactly like you'd think. So if we run this back, well, that's not exactly what we were trying to do. So to access the property of the process variable, we actually have to put it into parentheses. So let's rerun this, and we will do the same thing, except that we need to put a money sign symbol on the outside of parentheses, and then on the inside we will do the same thing, process.id, close it up, close the quotation marks, and then rerun our str variable, and we can see that did give us exactly what we were trying to do, process ID, and then the actual process ID number. So just a little bit of an oddity when trying to access the properties. You could always assign the process.id to a variable, and then you'd be able to assign it again in this variable. But if you're trying to do it in one fell swoop, you just use the parentheses first and then the $ on the outside of it. This is especially useful in JSONs, especially if you're building your own JSON. I often find myself using that methodology just to access the properties of the variables. All right, next, let's go over variables with multiple objects in them. So we'll grab our processes variable, and we will assign this again to our get process just to make sure we have what we want. And then we'll run this and see that we do have multiple objects in there. So we've got all of our process objects from our computer assigned to our processes variable. So let's look at accessing just one of the objects inside the processes variable. And to do this, we have to realize that when variables have multiple objects in them, it's simply just an array of objects. So to access them, we can use indexing, which is simply putting a number inside brackets to access that number. And we do have to remember with arrays that it starts at 0. So if we want to access the first process object in our variable, we simply write processes with our brackets and 0 in there, and that will return just one of the process objects, and that object being the first in the array of the processes variable. Now this can even go backwards, and if we put a -1 in there, it's going to access the last object. So definitely something cool. And if you don't know about arrays, just go and look up. There's plenty of resources on the internet about arrays. Get yourself familiar with them and realize in PowerShell that variables with multiple objects in them is simply just an array of objects. And something else cool that we can do with our array of objects here is use the count method, and that will tell us exactly how many objects we have in our array, which in this case is 375. And PowerShell is even smart enough to enumerate this and say that we want to access the name property of each of those objects. We can simply do our variable name dot name, and it's going to return the name of all of the objects in our array of objects. Let's look at another example of object enumeration with the for each object. So if we have our processes variable here, we can pipe this into for each object to take an action on every object in that array of objects by simply using our process parameter and then defining our script block. So we can achieve the same thing we just did by using our $_ to represent the current object in the pipeline, and then .name to access the name property. And if we run this, it's exactly the same thing that we just saw, but through a different type of object enumeration. And of course, that becomes super useful if you want to take more complex actions on different aspects of your objects in your variables. And let's look at a good example of this. So let's create a new variable called data, and we'll assign this to our processes variable, and we'll pipe that into for each object. And we are going to, for each of those objects, create a new object with a name property and assign that to the name property of the current object in the pipeline. And then we'll also create an ID property and assign that to the ID of the current object in the pipeline. So now if we take our data variable and pipe that into select object, we can just grab the first 5 to see what type of object we have in our data variable. And that simply is a new object with a name and ID property created using the data in our processes object. And we can see here, like we were just talking about, the ID did not get defined correctly because I did not use the parentheses. So let's go back and run this with the correct way, and we will put a money sign on the outside of our parentheses, and that will give us the ID. So you'll see the parentheses here used more than you think. Definitely something to be aware of and keep in the front of your mind. And then one last look at this for the enumeration is if we take our processes variable and pipe that into select object, we can grab multiple of the properties and pretty much do exactly what we had just done previously, but through a much cleaner methodology. Simply grab the name and ID of our process objects and put them into the pipeline. Okay, next let's go over declaring types. Now, PowerShell is usually smart enough to know what type of object we are putting inside of a variable, but there are cases where it's not going to get it correct, and we can specifically tell PowerShell what type of object we want in that variable. So let's look at an example of this. Say we have a number variable, and we'll assign that to read host and say enter a number. So this is going to ask us to put a number inside of that number variable, and we'll put 15 there. So now if we take our number variable and multiply it by 15, we should see, oh, that's not exactly what we wanted to do. And that is because PowerShell took 15 and turned it into a string object and not a int object. So how do we specifically tell PowerShell that we want that variable to hold an int? And we do that through something known as casting. So if we do the same thing, and in the beginning we just put int inside of brackets and then our number, and we'll assign that to the same read host to show how this is going to work. Now if we put 15 and take our number variable and multiply it by 15, it's actually going to do the math correctly. So there are going to be instances where PowerShell is not going to pick up the right variable that you want, where PowerShell is not going to pick up the right type of object that you want, but you can specifically tell PowerShell what type of object using that methodology known as casting, where you just put the type of object that you want inside of brackets before the variable name. And to look at some more examples of that, we can use single and double to define floating numbers, string to define a character array, char to specify just a singular character, and XML to define an XML document. So this is definitely a little bit more of an advanced topic, but something you do want to be aware of because you're going to run into instances, as we saw here, where PowerShell is not going to pick up the type of object that you've intended. So as a recap, let's look up some of the other commands that we can run on variables. So we can see these are some of the other commands that have to do with variables, but PowerShell is smart enough to do most of these things for you, except for perhaps remove variable. But all of these other commandlets are going to be able to be achieved using an ad hoc fashion. So just simply redefining using the equals, and you'll really never use these commandlets, but it is good to be aware that they are here. And just a couple last things to remember and take away from our lesson on variables. Keep your variable names descriptive and self-defining, but not too long, because once you get too long, it just becomes muddied. But you do want them to be as self-defining as possible. And then just remember that our $sign is not a part of the variable name. In this case, the variable name is number, and the $sign is just a call to the shell that this is going to be a variable. So that wraps up our lesson on variables. I hope you liked it. Be on the lookout for our next video, which is going to go over input and output. Until then, thanks for watching and have a good day.